A new feature from Zoom. All right, so welcome everybody to this remote interview. My name is Lisette and I'm interviewing people and companies doing great things remotely. And today on the line, all the way from North Carolina, it is my honor to be speaking with Darren Murph. And Darren, you are the head of remote at GitLab. We're going to talk about what that means. You're the author of several books. One is Living the Remote Dream. The other is the GitLab's Remote Playbook. We're going to definitely get to that. And fun fact, you are a Guinness World Record holder for most blog posts ever written. That's amazing. So we're going to get to that too. But let's start with, what does your virtual office look like? What do you need to get your work done?
Thanks for having me. So for the most part, I've been a homebody, especially during COVID. During normal times, I would say I'm 50-50 at home and on the road. So I have two distinct setups. So at my home, I have 3 monitors. This is definitely my proverbial NASA mission control. It's where I'm most comfortable. I have everything perfectly dialed in exactly how I want it, a height adjustable desk, the right keyboard, the right mouse. I've spent a lot of time fine tuning this that works for me. In terms of my virtual tool stack, it's very simple. I use GitLab, the platform, to do all of my work-related collaboration. I use Zoom for video chats, G Suite for all of the things that G Suite does, and Slack. And we use Slack in an unusual way at GitLab. We can get into that if you want. We delete all of our messages after 90 days, so we don't really use it for the typical things that most people use it for, but we try to keep our tool stack pretty minimal, so we keep communication fracturing to a minimum. So that's at home. When I'm on the road, I have a laptop riser, I have an external mechanical keyboard, an external mouse. And for the most part, I try to keep that setup fairly minimal as well when I'm traveling, but I do love the laptop riser. I didn't have one for many years. I splurged on one. They're not all that expensive, but it made a big difference being able to raise that up, especially now that I'm using more video. It gets it in a better spot. And I look forward to being able to travel more, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Indeed, I love working at home, but man, I do miss being in new places. It's totally different experience when you're forced at home than when you get to choose, right? It's nothing comparable. Let's dive into really quickly, for those who have lived under a rock for the last 5-10 years, like, let's just quickly say what GitLab is, what you guys do, and then I really want to dive into this head of remote position that you've come up with. So just in a nutshell, what is GitLab?
GitLab is a fascinating place. We build a complete DevOps platform. So we help people build great software and collaborate across teams. That's what GitLab does. But who GitLab is one of the most fascinating organizational designs I've ever seen. We are over 1,300 people across more than 65 countries and regions, and we have no company-owned offices at all. And it was intentionally structured as an all-remote company, and it has grown that way. So we have recruited that way. We have had people self-select into this way of working, and we have scaled something that was thought to be impossible 10 or 20 years ago. And now that much of the world has gone all remote, they are looking to us for the blueprint of how they make this transition. And instead of it being a stumbling block or a thorn in their side, it's something that they can actually leverage and take advantage of. And we're excited to help companies make that shift.
Yeah, and indeed, and I didn't even think about the scaling, because it says, I think I read on the website, it's really the largest all remote company in the world, as far as we know. Maybe it's different now that the pandemic has hit, right? Like everybody's remote, but okay. Can I ask you a bit about scaling? Because so many people say you cannot scale remote, but clearly you've done it, so that it proves that wrong. But I'm sure that there were some growing pains. What were some of the major challenges that you guys hit as you scaled?
A lot of it was mental. So when people come into GitLab, there's a very rigorous onboarding process where we meticulously document our ways of working. And I call these remote first ways of working. But the secret here is that much of what we do isn't unique to all remote. These are very good business principles that any business should be doing. But in an all remote setting, you have to commit to them much earlier in the stage of the company and with much greater intentionality. If you start going a different way, if you start with office first norms and not really documenting your values or your operational behaviors, or kind of let teams do what they want in terms of using tools to collaborate, and then what you're doing is using the office as a communication crutch to glue everything together. The risk there is, as you scale, as soon as that glue is removed, there's more chaos. And so in an all remote company, you really have to commit to using digital tools and using certain ways, remote first ways of working early on. And if you do that early on, it scales very nicely. Time zones is a great example of this. Time zones for most companies actually get more difficult at scale. And it makes you want to keep people within a single time zone so that there is some amount of synchronous overlap. But if you commit to asynchronous workflows early on, when you scale and you hire more people in a more diverse array of time zones, it actually gets easier because now you have more redundancy and more resiliency, people in more places where it's comfortable for them to work. So if you built the right infrastructure for work to be handed off around the globe, it actually gets easier at scale. So time zones is always a fun one to talk about.
Right, because yeah, there's a physics problem there, right? We can't, the time zones are always going to be an issue. And we're going to get into asynchronous, but I quickly want to ask about your onboarding processes, because I was reading through the handbook. I saw that you have a very different kind of onboarding process than most companies do. It is self-driven and self-learning. So how does that work? Somebody joins the company, they're handed the handbook, and what do you say? Like, okay, it's all in there. You just go for it. Ask when you have questions. I'm sure it's not that easy, but
there are people elements of it, but to a large degree, yes. But here's the thing. Most people start onboarding at GitLab before they ever join the company. We are very transparent about what we are and what life is like at GitLab. For those who aren't aware, the GitLab Handbook is now over 13,000 pages. So when I joined the company, it was around 2,500. So it has scaled massively. But we are public about what culture is like, what life is like. And so people do their research ahead of time, and you can find out what it's like to work at GitLab. That purifies our recruiting funnel. People self-select into wanting to work in this type of environment. So there's largely no surprises when you get here. You already can see what onboarding will look like. Once you do get here, onboarding happens within GitLab, the platform. This is a dog fooding technique so that you get comfortable and familiar with the GitLab platform that you'll be collaborating in and helping to build every single day. And we set it up very methodically. There are check boxes for weeks 1 through 4. You never know it's never a mystery what's coming. You know where you stand in the checklist, but it is largely self-driven. We hire for this principle of manager of one. We want people who are comfortable with autonomy and being a manager of their own attention. And you have to have that drive of self-service, because in an all remote organization, it's a lot more difficult to just tap someone on the virtual shoulder. And we want to reinforce the habit of looking first in the handbook before asking a person. And the reason for this is it's how you scale knowledge. We work handbook first. If it's not in the handbook, it doesn't exist. And so we want people to think first, I should query the handbook, see if the answer is there. And by the way, that's where all of our culture, our values, our operational procedures, everything is. And then if it's not there, certainly ask a person. And once you get the answer, make sure you document it in the handbook so that no one has to ask this question again. It is a unique way of working. But again, I go back to my earlier point. I would argue this is a better way of onboarding, even if everyone is in the office. It massively reduces the burden on a people or HR team from re-answering the same question hundreds or thousands of times. If it's documented, it's much more efficient. And if a new hire joins, they read something documented in onboarding and they see that there's a way it can be made better, we just make a simple update to the onboarding. We iterate on our onboarding all the time. Whereas if it's just hearsay or verbalization, it's much more difficult to concretely get better.
wow, that's amazing. So how many people, I'm sure, every company hires a certain number of people and there's a percentage that just don't make it. They come on board and then they're like, this wasn't what I expected, or this isn't for me. Where do people fail mostly when they're getting onboarded, or what is it that Yeah, that makes it so it's not successful.
That doesn't happen a lot at GitLab, mostly because you know what you're getting into. If you make it through the
Right.
interview process, none of it is in person, you understand what you're walking into. But I will say this, some people are shocked by how different it is. And depending on
Mhm.
how long you've worked in a more conventional co-located place, it is more or less jarring once you arrive and have to unlearn some of those things and embrace some ways of working that would get you blacklisted at a prior organization. One of these is sharing with a low level of shame. One of our substantiating values is low level of shame. And we encourage people to share their ideas, just these slivers of ideas, early and often, to receive input and feedback from everyone in the organization, because we believe the smallest idea, if it gets planted early, there's a lot of people that can jam and incubate on that idea and make it great. Now, this goes directly against conventional norms, which is don't ship anything, don't share anything until you've thought of everything, that it's perfectly polished. We want the opposite of that. And so convincing people that that's actually how we work and it's not a trap does take some time. There is a people element to the onboarding, which is called an onboarding buddy. We pair every new hire with someone who's been at the company for a while, and you can go to that person and ask as many questions as you want, and that person will most likely direct you to links in the handbook. But this person is also critical for building your stakeholder network. A lot of people joining remote teams right now are asking, how do I get to know people? What does my network feel like? In a co-located space, you're generally encouraged to wander the halls until you bump into the right people who will be your key stakeholders. Two problems there. One, it's massively inefficient. Two, it's a nightmare for introverts. So the onboarding buddy gets a grasp of what your job is, takes a look at the org chart, and intentionally sets up key early meetings for people that will be beneficial in forwarding your career. So it takes the guesswork out of it, and it makes it easy for people to know that they are being taken care of. The meetings that are being set up are with the right people, and it will really help them build a solid foundation.
Amazing. There's a lot to learn about. A lot of people are asking me about onboarding, and I think, yeah, there's a lot to learn there for companies, especially hiring remote and going remote. But I want to dive into next the handbook, your central repository for how the company is run, and it's open to the public. So let's first start with, why is it open to the public? That's amazing. I mean, that's pretty transparent. Everybody can see exactly the operations and the procedure, and it's very detailed. So it's not like there's a public version and a private version. There's one version. So why the transparency?
Yeah, this blew my mind when I was interviewing, and Handbook undersells it to some degree. What it really
Right.
is the actual operating manual of the company. Most people think of Handbook and it's some flimsy PDF that gets revised gently and emailed around to the company once a year, and you have to take some quiz to say that you've read it. The GitLab Handbook, we don't expect everyone to read 13,000 pages of it during onboarding. We just teach you how to search it. So some people ask me, hey, is the handbook too big? And I say, well, is there too much information on the internet? Or did you just learn how to use Google? And that's a bit tongue in cheek, but we just teach people how to find what they need instead of trying to constrict the amount of information. It is public because transparency is one of our core values. GitLab has 6 core values. Together they spell credit. I would say Google the GitLab values page. It is a fascinating read. You'll find all 6 values as well as substantiating values, sub-values underneath. Transparency is a value because it makes us a better business. And when our handbook is public to the world, it reinforces our mission of everyone can contribute. A lot of the GitLab product has been influenced by the community. And if you aren't public with your product, how will the community know how to make it better? The same goes for our organizational design. We want our values to be public because we want others to look at it and help make it better if they so choose. A few years ago, we had someone who was a copywriter find our values page, and they actually made a merge request. This is a function within the GitLab program to update and edit some of the grammar on our values page to make it more readable. That is
Wow.
exactly the type of behavior that we want to instill. And the values page in particular is always evolving. In 2020 alone, we had almost 100 iterations to the company values page. And so I say the word values, but in practice, these are the actual tangible ways that we treat each other and the behaviors that we want to encourage across the team as well as outside of it.
That's amazing. It's incredible to see that this is sort of the main repository. And actually, I was thinking about the transparency, and in a way, it's like, what's the harm? What if a company knows all the operations? And I mean, what damage would that do? I'm sure there must be some down. Have you experienced any downside? I should just ask. Is there any downside to doing that?
There's much more upside than there is downside. Strategy and culture is a great example of this. If you aren't public with your company strategy, if you aren't public about what matters to you, what your mission is, what drives you, if you aren't public about what your values are and how you treat people, if you aren't public with your stance on remote and what your stance on flexibility and paid time off are, think about what this does to candidates joining your team. They're basically joining a mystery, and they have absolutely no idea if it's going to be a place that aligns with them from a values perspective. And so you both spend all of this time and energy onboarding a new hire, and then 6 months down the road, they realize that what they perceive to be isn't matched up with reality. And now you've wasted a year of time. Scale that across your entire recruiting pipeline, and this is a massive inefficiency. If you make it public, people know what they're getting into. You enable people to do their own research without commandeering your time. And this is going to be a huge epiphany in the remote transition. In the past, holding things close to the chest could be a competitive advantage. But the truth is, the more that you share publicly and the more that you invite feedback and invite input, the more resilient you'll be to crises and the more open you'll be to new ideas. And this feeds into diversity and inclusion and all of the things that you want as the underpinning of your organization. The other thing is, there is an intrinsic link between belonging in a company and externally feeling like a company is relatable to you or resonates to you, and the amount of visibility and transparency in your work. So a lot of leaders are saying, how can I make my team feel like they belong? The answer is, make your work more visible and transparent. If it's easy for someone in the legal team to look across your system and see the goals and objectives of the marketing team, it's easy to feel like you're a part of the same team. You can see what people are working on. You don't have to ask. There's not this embedded mistrust of, why are these communication walls stood up? Tear those down. You want to be able to push the boundaries of that. Transparency isn't just good for morale and culture, it's generally good for business as well.
Indeed, it seems like we're graduating from this older style, this older command and control style. Hopefully, I mean, there's still so much of it that exists in the world, but even when I was reading Team of Teams by Stanley McChrystal, General Stanley McChrystal, he was also saying that the military had to adapt from the older command and control style to a more flattened, less hierarchical version, just because it allowed them to move faster and innovate quicker in terms of what they had to do. I'm assuming the same thing could happen for business. It's just a dinosaur model, based on what we had before. So
remote in general opens the eyes of the world to how much we were doing simply because it was the way that things have always been done. And that's the most dangerous sentence in all of business. Well, it's the way we've always done it. And going remote enables you and gives you permission to challenge all of those preconceived notions. And so public versus private, the amount of transparency is just one of many facets that companies are able to audit now with great permission.
What drives you? I mean, what do you love in particular about remote working?
Early on, it was the ability to travel. So my wife and I were able to visit all 50 US states, over 50 countries, while I earned a Guinness World Record. So it was very clear to me that remote work was life's greatest cheat code to actually do the things that most people have to put on their bucket list before you start slipping a disc in your back. That's where it started. More recently, it's become very personal to me because my wife and I adopted a newborn at birth a few years ago. And the ability to have an open adoption and welcome someone into our family in such an extraordinary way has fundamentally changed our perspective on life and love. And with workplace flexibility, it wasn't all that difficult to make happen. But if you look at that journey and compare it to what it would be like if you had the rigidity of a commute or a 9-to-5 every single day, it becomes much more difficult. And so now that I am an adoptive parent, I look at the orphan crisis. I look at how many kids need homes. And I think if just a small percentage of the newly remote workers post-COVID use their recaptured commute time to adopt or foster, we as a society could solve the orphan crisis in an incredibly short period of time with no additional investment or infrastructure at all. So what other crises exist that I'm not so intimately aware of that could also be solved by giving people their time back, and then they use it towards something that they're called to, that matters to them? This is a big deal. We talk about the tactical parts and the granular parts about remote work, but the real heart of it is the ability to fundamentally change how we think about life, the relationship between work and life. It enables so much more to be done when you aren't fighting for the moments around the fringes of a commute and a rigid 9 to 5. If that happens at scale, I am much more hopeful about the future.
Yeah, totally. Like, think of what we could do when we get the right minds working together to solve global problems. In fact, my own journey started with a guy who wanted to solve the problem of aging. And he was frustrated that longevity scientists weren't sharing data and collaborating to solve this pesky problem. And I was like, whoa, like, wow, aging. I never thought that that was a problem to be solved, but bring it on. You know, I'd love to stay young for as long as possible. But and I want to go back. I had a question about what you were doing, and I might just lose. Oh, I was just going to comment in terms of the commute. I'm hearing a lot of people saying, you know, as offices open up and people are starting to sort of go back on a part-time basis or even just a couple days a week, that they're noticing how inefficient and awful the commute actually is. They're just like, I can't believe I used to do this every single day. You know, like an hour commute was normal. I mean, in fact, an hour and a half, when I was in my 20s, I commuted an hour and a half each way. So yeah, it seems like madness to go back.
It's one of the most stunning things to me, and it has reinforced that obvious things are only obvious to whom they are obvious. Years ago, I was in a role that allowed some amount of work from home. On the days that I commuted into the office, I spent roughly 3 hours per day in rush hour traffic, gridlock traffic, mind-numbing traffic. So I would do that on a Monday, and then Tuesday, I would get up, wear whatever I wanted, and my commute was 30 steps. The difference in quality of life was so stark that there was just no unseeing it. For me, there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. And it is incredible to me that it took this amount of time for the rest of the world to see it, but I'm not going to complain about it. I'm glad it happened. It is surprising to me that it took this long, but once you've lived without it and you recognize that there is a different way to do it, there's no going back. And I really see this as the greatest transfer of institutional power in our lifetimes. And so the friction that you feel with people rejecting these commands to go back into the office is because, number one, they've proven in many cases that they can be productive and move their company forward without doing that. But two, when you've been in this situation for 18 or 20 months, you've had time to fundamentally change the way that you live. And despite all the negatives and all the stressors of the pandemic, and truth be told, most people haven't been able to work remotely yet. They've been working from home during a pandemic. They haven't actually enjoyed the spoils of proper remote work. And even given that, they can see that their time is better allotted by themselves and not dictated by a commute. That is an incredibly powerful force when you have a unified front agreeing to that.
Yeah, and I always say it's not remote work that people are excited about. It's the freedom, right? And the remote work is just our method of getting there. Like, we're busting out of I call it day prison, the offices, but that's my own, being dramatic. But yeah, we're busting out of day prison is what it feels like in this way. Okay.
The smart companies are realizing that it serves them as well. You can fundamentally de-risk your business if you decouple the results you drive from a piece of physical geography. The issue here is companies have to invest in the infrastructure to make it work. So the anecdote I give is that companies have spent years building a railway, and their work has been rail cars on top of them. So COVID comes along, knocks all the rail cars off, replaces it with sailboats. And so now you ask leaders, how is remote work going? And they say, well, sailing is terrible. But that's because they're trying to work in a new way based on old infrastructure. If you put in the investment to rip out the railway and build a waterway, all of a sudden sailing isn't so terrible anymore. But you have to make the investment to fundamentally change the infrastructure.
I love the analogy. And I want to dive quickly into what do you mean by infrastructure? Like, are you talking about their physical infrastructure, or is it a different kind of infrastructure that you're speaking of?
It's all types. And honestly, this is why I recommend the company hiring a head of remote. There is a lot to change. This is a fundamental re-architecting of how all work gets done. So it is physical infrastructure, yes, but it's also cultural infrastructure. I'm advising companies to do a values audit. Are your values just words on a wall, or are they literally converting tacit knowledge, the unspoken rules of working together, into explicit knowledge? As I mentioned earlier, low level of shame. In most companies, that would be tacit. You would need to work in teams for maybe a year or 2 years to see people operating with a low level of shame before it absorbed into you via osmosis and you thought, oh, I get it now. People are sharing things early and often. You have to convert that to explicit, literally write it down so that people know this is how we collaborate. And then the third part is the infrastructure on tooling. So at GitLab, we use the GitLab platform to collaborate. It is our central hallway where all work gets done. So even if our design team is mocking something up in Photoshop, they will create a GitLab issue and link to their mockup so that everyone in the company has visibility to the tool that they're using. And that type of rigor around documentation and making sure that your work is transparent, it requires that cultural foundation to be built, but you also need a tool like GitLab to be able to facilitate this new way of working.
Right. So indeed, there's three components to it. If I heard correctly, there's the physical component of like our offices are going to need to change physically based on the new way that we use these kind of spaces. There's
Yeah, and like shipping laptops to 65 countries, which shout out to First Base, Chris Hurd's company is making this easy for companies to do. But yes, managing physical infrastructure across a global footprint. But thankfully, there are companies to handle that. So that's one.
Yeah.
I'll let you. I'll
Good
let you
shout out.
proceed.
Yeah. Good shout out actually, because that is a huge issue for companies, right? Like who's going to do that? How do you do it? And now I've also heard of, it's not software as a service, but it's more like infrastructure as a service. Instead of buying a whole big system, you rent it out on a monthly subscription basis. Makes total sense, right? Like, it's like, then you can change it out. Like, oh, the Zoom room didn't work. Let's put in a, I don't know what the replacement would be, whatever it would be. Okay, so the second one is then your cultural infrastructure. That's good. The way we behave, the documentation, the going more written communication, and then there's the tools, the apps, the software in which we communicate and collaborate and become more transparent. So there's quite a lot. And we've got to talk now about head of remote, because that just segues right into head of remote. How long has GitLab had this head of remote position, and what exactly, and okay, let's start with that. How long have you had it? And then why did you create it?
July 2019 is when I joined. So this was before the onset of the pandemic. GitLab was scaling rapidly and realized that they wanted to put intentionality around operationalizing our expertise in remote fluency and then creating an avenue to share this with the world. So I look at my role as very inside, outside. You have to have great infrastructure. People have to be able to work really well remotely. They need the right tools, the right guidance, the right learning and development, the right onboarding, the right culture. There are a lot of things that go into making sure a team can work well remotely. And then what happens is that reflects externally. GitLab is a very open company. We share our entire handbook with the world. And so it just made sense to share our remote guidance with the world. And so the external part of my job was to talk to media, talk to people like you, and to convert our knowledge that was in the handbook into the remote playbook, effectively creating a blueprint for the world to go remote when it needed to do it most. So I joined before COVID, and it turned out that timing was spectacular, because right when the world needed it, GitLab was in a position to share. Most companies, COVID happened to them and they thought, oh no, this has never been done before. How are we going to figure it out? And GitLab was there to raise our hand and say, actually, we've been doing this for a really long time. This is how we did it. And because so many of these principles are foundational business principles, not exclusive to all remote, it has become incredibly practical and implementable across many industries.
So what's in it for GitLab to share how you've done it? I mean, you guys could keep operating in your own bubble and like rock it, and everybody else is like getting left in your dust. So why go out and share it?
First off, it spurs awareness about GitLab. So this helps GitLab because the more people know that GitLab exists, if they learn about us by us helping them create their blueprint for transitioning to remote, they're more likely to have positive sentiment on the product that we build. And we build a product that enables collaboration. So we have seen that halo effect be very practical. But I'll also say that it's just who we are. Our mission is everyone can contribute. And if we put our product documentation out, it makes sense that we should also put our organizational design principles out, because we want other companies to see what we're doing and learn from them. We want to be a part of mass proliferation of remote work because the rising tide will lift all boats. If we can help the world become more remote fluent, it becomes a better business atmosphere for us to operate in. A great example of this is Dropbox. So we collaborated closely with Dropbox as they were making their virtual first transition. And when their early handbook went live, there was a section on there about declining meetings in favor of asynchronous workflows. It was a very simple section where they gave copy and pastable sentences so that anyone in Dropbox could share it with anyone else in Dropbox for a non-awkward way to decline a meeting and force a new way of working. I thought this was brilliant because it takes away that junior seniority awkward complex and it just makes it formalized. It's converting tacit to explicit. So we were able to add that to the GitLab handbook. And so now there's a citation for Dropbox's handbook, making GitLab's handbook better. None of that would happen if we weren't public about it and openly shared it with the world.
I love it. You know, it reminds me in the very beginning when I first started interviewing people, I started to meet people that were doing similar things to what I was doing. And I could have looked at them as competitors. And this is a shout out to you, Pilar and Judy. But instead, I mean, we became friends. So there was no use like being competitors. We became friends. But instead, we actually saw that by collaborating together, we were creating a bigger market for ourselves. And at the same time, having a lot more fun. Right? Like, because, you know, we're like, we each have our own niche and clients recognize that. They know who to go to. And, you know, if they want like more clean language, they'll pick Judy. And if they want more podcasting, they'll pick Pilar, you know? So it's I can see that philosophy and I wish there were more of that in the world, I must say.
Well, the truth is strategy is easy to write down, but it's in the execution of it, the nuance of it that really makes us human. So even though two things can be alike, two restaurants that serve the same kind of food, there will be nuances to it. The waitstaff does things a bit differently. Whoever chooses the Spotify playlist might do things a bit differently. The ambiance is a bit different. These are the nuances, the fabric of what makes us human. And so the more that we share, the more that we're able to get inspiration from each other. And if we've seen anything, the remote community needs to band together at a moment like this. The world needs guidance. And the truth is, we're all more alike than we are unalike. There's this wide spectrum of remote, from completely co-located to all remote and everything in between. And although we could pick apart what works for which industry or which works for what leader, the truth is the foundational underpinnings are incredibly uniform across the spectrum. And the more that we can get that message out, the more unity we'll find and the faster we'll progress as a working society.
Love it. Indeed. There's enough for everybody. And this whole winner takes all thing is one of those outdated, I feel like it's just an outdated concept. Like there's enough for everybody. So let's do that.
Here.
We're running out of time. I've got so many questions, but I do need to talk about hybrid. That is the word du jour of the day, of like companies saying, well, we want to give people a choice. And actually I kind of like, hybrid, I actually really like the freedom to choose, because there are many people out there that hate working from home or don't like working from home or don't like working in a co-working space. They want to go to the office. They want to be in a place every day for whatever reason. My husband is amongst this group of people, like hates working at home and loves his office. And sometimes he has colleagues and sometimes not, but it's a place for him to go. So hybrid seems to be the future because the future is choice. However, hybrid is the most difficult style. Hands down, we all know this because it's like herding cats. You've got people all over now, some in person, and those in-person relationships and interactions, they're just really powerful compared to remote. What advice do you have for people going hybrid? Is it just like, don't do it? No, no, I'm kidding. But what tips can you give companies?
On the surface, hybrid looks like it's the best of both worlds. But without incredible intentionality, it quickly devolves into the worst of both worlds.
Right.
And the truth behind that is that there's actually no such thing as hybrid. A company is either remote first or office first. And the reason I bring this up is that the global conversation around hybrid is fixated on where people are physically located, which is an incredibly misguided conversation. It's really about how work gets done. And so here's how you can change the way you think about this. Audit every single workflow in your organization and ask yourself, can this work without the office as a crutch? If you whiteboard on a physical whiteboard that is not connected to the internet, you are whiteboarding office first. And the moment that anyone isn't in the office, the entire thing falls apart. This is a risk. You need to address this. There are actually companies that I'm familiar with that have an on-site component, as in a subset of their entire employee base cannot work remotely. They manufacture things, they make things, but they are still pivoting to remote first. What this means is that although there are some people who will have to go into a facility, the way that they work is going to be remote first. They are going to collaborate and communicate on a digital platform so that their life gets easier. They have more access to information because their colleagues, although they aren't there in person, are feeding in even more information than before because they've changed the way that they utilize tools, apps, and documentation. The conversation is much, much less about where people are, much more about how work gets done. And I also want to mention this about work from home versus the office. Most companies assume there are only two places to work, your home or the office. That is not true. There is this vast third space in between, communal work centers like Switchyards and Cody. You have your conventional co-working places like WeWork. And then there are actual offices that are white label, unbranded, that you can rent on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. The most inclusive way for companies to approach this is to allow people to submit expense reports for their external office usage. You can't assume that everyone will want to work from home or that they have an environment that is conducive to working from home. But that doesn't mean that you have to buy an office to outfit people in working in an office-like environment. And the real danger of hybrid is that if you have a subset of people who are in the office by default and a subset who are remote by default, you run the risk that half of your organization is working office first, the other half is working remote first, and they begin to resent each other. This is the classic dysfunctional breeding that happens. And of course, if proximity bias creeps in, where the people who are in the office more get seen more, they get praised and promoted more, it completely ostracizes the other part of your workforce. And again, this is a massive risk. If this lingers long enough, it will begin to show in places like Glassdoor. It will impact talent branding, acquisition, and retention. These are things that are not frequently seen or appreciated. But if you've ever lived an extended period in a hybrid setting on the remote side, you will know intimately what I'm talking about.
And it's a brilliant way to say we need to pivot to remote first instead of being office first, because if location is a factor, regardless of which location, home, office, co-working, whatever it is, then you're taking a risk. I like how you put this. You're really just taking a risk. All right, man, I want to dive into async and a bunch of things, but let's end on a fun note. So your Guinness World Record, this is amazing. Did you set out to set a Guinness World Record, or how did this happen?
I did not set out to earn a Guinness World Record, but for context, I was working at a consumer technology publication called Engadget and achieved a world record. I'm the planet's most prolific professional blogger. So at the time that the award was bestowed, it was over a 4-year span. I wrote over 17,000 articles and 6 million words. So this averaged out to an article being published every 2 hours, 24/7, 365 for 4 consecutive years, which is a lot. So now it's up to over 25,000 articles across the web, over 10 million words. The record still stands. So here's how it came to be. When I joined Engadget, it was a globally distributed news organization. And it was my first foray into all remote. And I immediately saw the value and the efficiency in having people in 6 continents able to contribute to a 24/7 news cycle. We were incredibly fast and incredibly efficient. And when I became managing editor, I realized that as I was hiring and onboarding people, I was answering the same questions over and over again. So I started writing them down in a very rudimentary company wiki. These days, we would call it a GitLab Handbook, but in those days, it was a simple wiki. So when someone would join the company a week prior, I would send them the entire Engadget wiki and say, read all of this. This will get you 95% of the way to being a great editor. Read all of this, invest time in reading it, ingest it. Let me know what questions you have. And then every question that wasn't already in the wiki simply made the wiki better. I would go in and add that so that each successive hire had a more emboldened and bolstered onboarding process. And that's where it all started with me. And that's really where I fell in love with the efficiencies around remote work. And largely because of those efficiencies, I was able to write really fast. I'm a natural storyteller. I love it. I found my passion. I worked with an all remote team that was incredibly efficient and empowered me to be very, very quick at that. And also it was the golden era of consumer technology. Some of us remember when the original iPhone came out, everything changed. Consumer tech went from something that was relevant to a relatively small demographic to relevant to everyone. And that cultural explosion was amazing to be a part of.
Totally. We're really in the next revolution of work, which is very exciting. You know, we hear like, oh, it was the Industrial Revolution. I don't know what this one's called, but it's blowing things apart. So is your prolific writing also part of the reason why the handbook is 13,000 pages? Is that your fault?
It's funny you mentioned that, but I will say yes. In just over a year, I contributed 100,000 words just to the remote portion of the GitLab Handbook. And the remote playbook, if you go to allremote.info, you can download the remote playbook. It's a beautiful PDF engineered by our design team. It takes those 100,000 words and distills them down into something that's easily readable in an afternoon with a good cup of coffee. We distilled down the absolute essential information for companies who are making the transition. And if you want to learn more, you can find additional links and all of those 100,000 words from allremote.info.
Amazing. I'll also put a link in the show notes so that people can just find it really quickly. So a couple of just quick questions. So in terms of all this writing, how do you find time for deep work? Right? Because clearly with writing, you need to be thinking and writing. And a lot of people are really tied to their inboxes or tied to like the messaging going back and forth. What's your secret for deep work?
Ruthlessly take control of your day. If your meetings are overtaking your life and you just give people carte blanche permission to just railroad your day with meetings, you will never get deep work done. There's no life hack or secret to it. It just comes down to minutes in a day. I ruthlessly block my calendar for deep focus time. And sure, I miss out on some things, but as my friend John Fitch would say, look at it from a JOMO perspective, the joy of missing out. There's a joy of not being able to do some things because you are ruthlessly prioritizing others. And as you do this, you tend to get better at it and you see what actually matters in terms of moving work forward. So no big life hack or epiphany there, just be ruthless about it and try to foster a culture and psychological safety where other people can do this as well. We all have real lives. We all have real work that we need to get done. And if you are managing your day by your calendar, then that's where the blocks have to be. And you have to honor them even when it's not easy.
Man, that is really good advice. All right. Second to the last question, what advice do you have for people that are just getting started? Okay, they're not just we've all lived through the pandemic, but like we're coming out of the pandemic and like I would say just getting started from this vantage point of becoming remote first instead of office first. Where do you advise people to start after reading the handbook that you've written?
Yeah, for leaders, I would say check out Workforce. This is an amazing publication. They have an entire playbooks section where they have distilled down playbooks from all of the world's open source companies, GitLab included. So after you've read GitLab's, read everyone else's. There is a ton of information from companies who have done this before. Oh, and by the way, make sure you hire a head of remote or designate someone in your company to manage this full time. If you want this transition to work well, it needs to be someone's full-time job. This is a massive, massive deal. On the employee side, I would say challenge every preconceived notion you've ever had. Is where you're living where you actually want to live? Do you want to optimize your life for better access to a medical center, to nature, to better air quality, to home, wherever home is, to a community that matters to you? You really start to appreciate remote when you decouple where you live. So if you're just working from home in the same city that you moved to be able to commute to an office, you really aren't taking advantage of it. Start picking up an atlas, look around the world and see if there's a place that would better inspire you to wake up every day. And start there. It's a fun process to journal.
So you really can live the remote dream. It is really possible. And you got to read Darren's book, Living the Remote Dream. All right. So last question, super easy one, which is if people want to learn more about you, what's the best place to go on the internet? Is it Twitter? Is it LinkedIn? Is it GitLab? Where should people go?
Start with Twitter. I'm Darren Murph on Twitter. You'll also find me on LinkedIn. Those are the two core places I'd love to hang out.
Awesome. Darren, I can't thank you enough. It's been a real honor to talk to you today. I took copious notes here, so the show notes should be nice and long, but really I appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thanks all. Thanks all for listening.
All right, everybody. Until next time, be powerful.